Hi, I'm Lucus Garron, the leader of the WCA Regulations Committee, and you're listening to episode 90. Thanks for listening.
Hi, this is Daniel Goodman.
Dylan Wang from JPerm.
Ian Scheffler.
Kiran Bansal from India.
This is Alex from Z3 Cubing.
What's up, guys? This is Jaden McNeil from Australia, and you're listening to the Corner Cutter Podcast.
That's right. Welcome to the Corner Cutter Podcast. Podcasting since 2014 and cubing since 2015. I'm your host, Josh, and this is a speed cubing podcast dedicated to in-depth interviews with cubers from all across the sport. My website is thecornercutterpodcast.com. And thank you so much for joining me today for episode 90. Before we jump into today's interview, I want to mention that this episode is brought to you by the Patreon supporters who support the show on a monthly basis. And these supporters are Reggie, Kathleen, and Felipe, all who give generously every month. And you three, thank you so much for your continued support. So, today's guest is Lucus Garron from the WRC, which is the Regulations Committee at the WCA, World Cube Association. They're the organization that hosts all official Rubik's Cube competitions, or should we not use the word Rubik's Cube in that? So I brought Lucus on the podcast to discuss what the Regulations Committee is, what they do, their daily tasks, how new regulations are implemented. Then we get into why feet was removed, and we talk through that process. And then we get into clock a little bit, and finally we wrap up with some new changes to the 2020 regulations, or new changes that they've put into the 2020 edition of the regulations. I think this is a fascinating discussion. I learned so much, and I'm really glad Lucus shared so much information with all of us. And this definitely qualifies as an in-depth conversation. So let's jump right into the interview. Hey, Lucus, welcome to the Corner Cutter Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So could you explain what your job at the WCA is on the Regulations Committee?
Yeah, gladly. So the WCA has several committees, and the Regulations Committee is the oldest one, which was formed because Ron, who was one of the co-founders, was just maintaining the regulations by hand. People asked him for some changes, and he sort of did whatever he thought would be best. But that became difficult to scale. So some of us offered to redo the regulations, and then there was a need to keep them updated. And I think for the time being, there's a regular need to keep the regulations up to date. And there's been a parallel task that has evolved, which is that we regularly get new kinds of incidents. When you get the kind of growth we've been having, there's always something that used to be uncommon that becomes common. And so a lot of the time we deal with reading the internal delegate reports and providing feedback on incidents, and providing often decisions saying, we think this is the best interpretation of the regulations, and here's how we should change this kind of issue going forward. So okay. Maintaining regulations and incidents, very roughly.
What are the daily tasks, and how much time does it take up?
So the main daily task is reading the incidents from delegate reports. There's sometimes, I think we've reached 20 competitions on a weekend. So with 10 members right now, even if we read all of them well spread out, that's 2 per member. And so a lot of time is just spent making sure that we've responded to every question that a delegate has. Because if there's a major incident, the delegate should be writing it down, and we should be looking at it and trying to figure out how to make sure to resolve this consistently. And this ends up taking the majority of our time. And then for different parts of the year, we're, let's say, working on the regulations or working on other projects, but that background work never goes away. and is really a sort of not super visible part of something that we do all the time.
Does the whole regulation committee make a decision on an incident as a whole, or being on the regulations committee, can an individual make a decision if the delegate's not sure?
So we have a process for this. We have on GitHub a repository which includes, for example, an operations document. So it used to be, it was a bit informal how we did this. We talked until we came to a conclusion, but we wanted to be able to get quicker decisions. So formally, there's sort of 3 levels, one of which is if it's something that's come up before, someone just asks a question, and let's say there was a guideline that's not obvious, or a recent incident that is basically the same, then often a member will just reply and say, this is how to resolve this. And so the document says that's how we should do it in that case, but you should escalate it if it's more complicated. So in the general case, we raise it to a vote of the entire committee, and at least half the members have to vote, and at least half of them have to agree on the outcome. Okay. So right now, there's 10 members, so it means 6 would have to vote, and 4 of them would have to agree, because it has to be more than half. Just half actually doesn't count. And in order to make major decisions, usually that's fairly rare, but it still happens fairly regularly, and it's sort of the formal process. But there's gradations in between where we always have to ask, this is similar to something else. Like, let's say somebody accidentally did a move on their cube versus on multiple blindfolded. Well, previously we said if we find out that their cube had a sticker on it, that should be disqualified rather than the whole attempt. Maybe doing a move on a puzzle by accident should also be handled similarly. So there's cases like that where, we don't necessarily go to a full vote, but it's always case by case.
How long does it usually take to resolve an incident?
So we have a goal of replying to things within 48 hours. The WCA has a communications policy where the goal is to, everyone should be available within 48 hours. We don't always meet that, but our goal is to at least say we're discussing it within 48 hours if it's something really important. And usually if something is really important, someone will send us a separate email, like immediately at the competition sometimes, asking, there's this unusual thing that really affected important results. Can we get a quick answer? And we try to respond to those quickly.
Mm-hmm. So like Sundays and Mondays are usually your busiest days?
Not necessarily. Sometimes the delegates' reports come in a few days later, and I don't feel like there's a huge load and a huge pressure to do things on any particular day. But if there's a major incident, usually it'll be like on the weekend. We have an internal communications Slack for the WCA. So if there's something happening at a competition, you'll usually get a notification there.
Moving on a little bit, what would you say is the most pressing issue facing the WCA right now?
Most pressing issue is actually an interesting way to phrase it, because I think one of the biggest issues we're facing is trying to stay productive and collaborative at a scale where not everyone knows each other. So I think actually something like a code of conduct is becoming really important. And there's some things I can't really go into, but there's an effort internally to start collecting, okay, what should a code of conduct cover? And there's been efforts to do things like we've started setting up a WCA forum. So presumably it should apply to online interactions within the WCA, but it also needs to be able to deal with people mistreating each other outside of whatever just happens to be considered WCA. So being able to deal with harassment, or being able to deal with people just attacking each other is becoming a pretty important thing to do. And I feel like if we don't do that, we're letting bad behavior or aggressive behavior go unaddressed, and that can make the entire organization fall apart. And I think, given a lot of reading I've seen about companies that scale, like we have some of the similarities in the WCA as an organization, we've hit the point where this is really important to get right, or it's only a matter of time before there's a major incident that we're unprepared to handle and can split the community or drive out really good people. So I think having some sort of code of conduct is becoming rapidly the biggest thing that we could do to make sure the WCA keeps being a good place in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then I also have a second answer, which is that personally, I think we should really be thinking about how to handle a list of events. Right now, there's a list of 18, just went down to 17 official events, and unofficial events aren't held as often. And this makes it difficult to have discussions about the list of official events. I'm going to go a lot more into detail in a bit in that.
Sure, yeah. Could you go through or walk us through the process of what it takes for a change to happen, whether it's in the regulations or like blindfolded cubes not being able to have logos on them, or changing the 4 and 5 blind means to averages? What does it take to make a change like that?
Those are actually two interesting representative examples. In the case of blindfolded logos, it was something that came from inside the WRC to address issues we were seeing. And those tend to be harder to explain to the outside, but often we can find a reasonable balance. And then the example of 4 or 5 blind means came originally from the 3 blind mean proposal from somebody outside the WRC. So they're actually two good different sides of the coin, let's say. Officially, the regulations can be updated any time. What happens is the WRC updates a wording change and sends it to the board, and the board approves it. And there's a few extra steps depending on how we're doing things, like we need to make sure that it's required for us to get delegate feedback, and we should be getting feedback from the entire community before we make major changes. So while the regulations can get textual updates, let's say fixing typos and small interpretations a lot, we actually don't tend to do it as much because it can get confusing if there's changes halfway through the year and we have to constantly tell delegates to keep checking. So in practice, we tend to do one big change at the beginning of the year, which is usually January. We've had talks about changing it to a different part of the year, but for the time being, we're sort of thinking of it as a yearly update, trying to do it at the beginning of the year, even though in 2018 it was actually in May. And going to the examples of that you mentioned, into the example of the stickers for blindfolded not being able to have logos. This is an interesting one because it's actually one where I sort of personally disagree with what we came up with. So the issue was that we kept having incidents where you can see in the video that someone had a logo, but you can't tell whether they could feel it. And so I, for example, had a cube where I had custom printed stickers that you couldn't feel the difference for. But there were some that were slightly raised that you could definitely feel the difference for. And for blindfolded, for some methods like M2, it's very useful to be able to tell whether you have parity. And so we discussed it and came to the conclusion that it was much easier to say, okay, you can normally have a logo, but for blindfolded, you can't. And then you can easily tell from video evidence whether the puzzle was allowed or not. And this is one of those that's a little bit harsher than we would like, but being a little bit more strict allows us to be more consistent. And most people ultimately agree that it's a reasonable line to draw. And so it was a balance that we had to make, that we ended up with that. We did a similar thing, for example, with cameras, where we decided to say you should be allowed to film with cameras, but there should be certain limits so that we don't incentivize some easy cheating methods. And I think for the most part, people think we end up at a reasonable balance. There's disagreements on both sides. The 3 blind mean was actually introduced by contrast by someone from the community. I forgot who proposed this one. I could look it up. So somebody proposed adding 3 blind means to the WCA website. So it said it wouldn't change how competitions work. We would just recognize the means, and you would get a ranking, and we would have world records. And we evaluated and said, this is something that is more fun for the WCA spirit and doesn't really hurt some of the other things we're doing. So we adopted that. And a few years later, we said, okay, 4 and 5 blind means have some of the same trade-offs. It doesn't hurt people too much to introduce these extra means. There's a bit of a risk that you're encouraging people to go for entire means at competitions and for competitions to hold 3 instead of fewer attempts if they might have. Like you can imagine competitors pressuring organizers to say, I want 3 attempts so I can get a mean. But this is a little bit less of a concern because competitors who are, good enough and have the stamina and can fit in under their time limits to do a mean were probably already having a decent chance of doing that at some of their competitions. So the trade-offs ended up being, we've tried this with 3 blind, let's do it for 4 blind. And it seems that people were generally in favor and there haven't been too many bad consequences. But it wasn't something that the WRC saw, oh, here's a problem we need to fix. It was something someone proposed and we discussed, and the trade-offs were good.
So when it's going through the final proposal, who actually votes on and makes the decision?
So the WRC can decide its own process, but in practice, what we tend to do is vote at least for topics. So we will usually do regulations in a large batch. So we'll vote for topics, and anything that has a majority, or what we went for last year is a little bit more than a majority, actually, we at least consider. And then at the end, we also have some sort of vote. So in this case, we voted on the topics that were a bit more controversial, again, to see if we agreed on particular resolutions and revisions. So very roughly, we go for a majority of WRC vote for a regulations update, and then we send it to the board, and the board has their own process, but they essentially do a majority vote. And it's our job to make sure that by the time it gets to the board, we've explored the trade-offs, and they just sort of need to say, okay, everything looks good, yes. And we usually get, I think, unanimous board vote for that. And officially, only the WRC and the board are the decision makers for this. But as many people have seen, the community will strongly react to certain things. So it is our job to listen to the community. It's literally a requirement for us. And we also, our goal is to make speed cubing better. So we have various mechanisms to involve delegates with polls. We've talked about doing a survey, and unfortunately that didn't work last year, but there might be one this year. And there are some mechanisms we've used to reach out to competitors, but those aren't formal decision-making mechanisms.
So so that would be trying to get feedback from the actual competitors and people actually participating in the sport.
Yes. So a great example is we were trying to figure out how to handle potential fewest moves notation changes. So I reached out to Sebastiano Tronto, who is, I think he has both world records now.
Yeah, and he was featured on the podcast a while ago.
Yeah, he's a great communicator, and what he did for us is he went through discussions in, mostly I think the Facebook group, and summarized polls and comments, and said, okay, so we can either do this large change or we can do this smaller change, and here are the trade-offs, and I recommend this. And this was great because he really knew what the trade-offs mean for competitors, and he also gave us a great viewpoint of what at least a slice of the very active community thinks. It may be biased to people, English speakers who can contribute on that particular group where a lot of the discussions are, but it gave us a great insight without us having to basically figure out from scratch how do we think this is going to affect people. Because we don't have time to ask everyone, but the top people in an event know roughly the issues and might know, so-and-so uses an approach that would be affected by this change, or be able to reach out to people that we wouldn't necessarily have access to. So I tried reaching out to a few people that way, and I think we'll need a balance of try to reach out to everyone and also try to focus on the people who will be most affected and who can give really specific feedback to a particular topic.
Okay. Is there anything else you would like to mention on specifically on the WRC before we move on to the topic of events? Well,
they're related. I think one thing that is becoming clear is that there's a growing disconnect between the WCA and externally. And so a lot of people are really positive and constructive, and some people aren't. And this is a difficult thing to balance because if you have a discussion where anyone can chime in and people can be really loud, you might have to spend time addressing them rather than addressing the real points, as much as we try to do that. And unfortunately, it means often that we withdraw a little bit. And so we don't discuss things as openly if, for example, an individual WRC viewpoint gets taken as representative of the entire WRC, or if someone says, I think this might be a good idea, and it gets taken out of context as saying, like, someone in the WRC is arguing for this. And so I want us to be able to balance that. And this is sort of a big issue going forward. And we have a WCA forum that hopefully will launch at some point where we can have a proper way to say, okay, if you want to discuss things without discussing the technical changes, like higher level ideas, maybe here's at least an appropriate place where we know, like, you can comment here. We know we will listen, and there are people to make sure to moderate so that the discussions don't get out of hand. And I think there's something each side can do to make sure that we're listening to each other really well. And this is something that I would like us to really focus on for this year. I think there's a bridging to be done because we've now reached this scale that hasn't been very actively addressed, and I'd like it to be more active.
One other question I had was, how much time does being on a committee take? And I understand none of these positions are paid.
Yes. Right now, everything in the WCA is volunteer-based. And usually when someone puts out a call for new members, so for example, the regulations team just put out a call for new members, usually there'll be something saying you should expect to work so and so many hours per week. But that varies a lot. So for the WRC, I believe we said 10 hours a week. Most weeks don't actually take that, but like it should be up to that much, especially if it's a busy week or if we're working on the regulations. And for the leader, it's a little bit more. But the workload varies, and in particular, since we're volunteer-based, if we expect people to treat this like a job and really professional about it, then we would be sort of excluding people who can contribute at times, like students, let's say, who are going to be busy with exams, but then have free time over the summer. And those can be really valuable contributors to a team. So I try to be a little bit flexible with how I handle that on the WRC if somebody's got busy periods and free periods. But overall, the goal is to have, under 10 hours a week of work roughly spread out throughout the year, with lots of details that make it not quite that in practice.
Now let's dive into 3x3 with feet.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, start from where it started a few years ago when the first hints of it possibly being removed came up, and walk us through what's actually happening and where it's at now?
I think one interesting thing about 3x3 feet is that there was not a particular time where people started saying we should remove the event. So there were conspicuous things like U.S. nationals. Before there was a requirement to hold every event at major championships, U.S. nationals didn't hold feet because the organizers didn't want to have to deal with the logistics and the trade-offs. But people have sort of been disparaging the event since the beginning, and people have been defending the event since the beginning. So I believe it actually started at the first World Championship when someone was talking to a reporter. So I'm not 100% sure of the story, but the reporter said, so you solve it with one hand, like, can you solve it with your feet? And the person who was being interviewed said, yeah, I can. And so that's how it became an event. And there was not an official event list until about 10 years ago. And it became one of the official events. And since then, as competitions have started, becoming more and more thorough about systematizing how to judge and things like that. I think one of the main complaints comes from organizers who feel like they have to go out of their way to make some accommodations specific for feet. You have to rearrange the stage. You have to put mats on the floor, maybe protect the mats from the floor. You might want to use separate equipment because some people have hygiene concerns about feet. And even if most people have clean feet, judges and scramblers will sometimes refuse to judge or scramble because they think it's going to be smelly or uncomfortable. And so it's harder to find people for the event. And so organizers are not as outspoken about this in the community, but a lot of them have concerns like this and would like not to be able to hold feet. But we have this requirement that you have to hold them at all major championships. So they're stuck in this thing where the only way for them not to hold feet is to ask it not to be an official event, which is not true. They can also ask for us to change how we have our requirements, but it sort of seems like this trade-off. But in the meantime, especially recently, people like Daniel Rose-Levine have gotten really serious about the feet event. And so it's turned into, let's say, rather than something you do for fun on the side, into something fairly serious on its own. And so this trade-off gets harder and harder. And I think the unfortunate thing is that in our mind, we think of an event, something as either an event or not an event, and there's nothing in between. And that's something I would like to change. But about 2 years ago, and we're still in this mindset, Laura, who is the current WRC leader, said, okay, this is something that people, especially organizers, keep asking about, saying, can you remove feet? And let's see, how can we measure it? So we asked the delegates, we held a poll, and the delegates were evenly split, I think just a little bit more in favor of removing the event. And so it seems the community is split, the delegates are split. How do you go from here? Because you can't have an event. So we had a discussion, and I wasn't actually involved in the final stages of the discussion, but we ended up coming up with requirements. And I don't quite like where we ended up with, because we set some high targets for feet, and we said, we'll change the event format to average of 5, see if that changes the amount of interest. And if there's a bit more interest, if it catches up to the other events in terms of popularity, then we'll keep it. Otherwise, we'll remove it, and then we'll have a final decision about the event. And like I said, I think these targets were not super well chosen, and I unfortunately didn't participate in that email thread where we discussed this at the point where it reached that. And I think it was a bad idea to keep that private, because it's sort of like a secret test. And in the end, it actually doesn't seem to have mattered that much that we made it private, because what happened the year after I had just become WRC leader. So I inherited this decision, this proposal to say, we'll change it to average of 5, and we'll see if the participation changes. I said, okay, the new year is coming up soon. So I think what we should do is say, we're going to remove it because on this process, but we know this is going to affect people a lot, because regulations changes like this have a much larger impact than they used to. So we're going to say we will remove it next year. And then if anything really substantially changes, then we can revise that. For example, if the numbers had changed, if participation, let's say, doubled, we would definitely have revised it. So it turns out over the year that the numbers didn't change very much. They changed a little bit, especially at the end of the year when people wanted to sort of like hold feet one last time. But they didn't change that much, and the hygiene concerns remained, and the community was still mostly split. And there was a lot of discussion, and so I think it was a bit of a mistake to have this out for an entire year without more structure to the discussion. Like, if we were delaying it for a year and we wanted to make it clear that we were open to revising it, we should have at least set some targets, saying, all right, if people really, really care about this event, and it's not just the outspoken ones, then let's see, we can set a public target and maybe keep it if it reaches that. And that target might be to reach the popularity of other events. So we were wary of doing that originally, because we had a plan, a proposal, and even if it wasn't perfect, constantly changing past decisions is really volatile for the WCA. and we didn't want to do that. So the way I usually described it to people when they ask is there was a plan, and so we delayed the removal for a year, but the plan was to evaluate the popularity, and feat is removed if it doesn't reach that. And this is sort of like a professional, like if we decided this is the WCA process, even if some of us disagreed personally with it. And so you came around, there was a lot of discussion. Some people wanted to save feat, but there wasn't, I sort of said, unless somebody comes up with a good alternative to figure out what to do instead, this is the default. We'll have to remove it because that was the process. And one hope was that we would have a community survey and try to figure out really a broad viewpoint of how do people feel about this. Is it that a lot of people are really in favor and a lot of people are neutral? Or is it that quite a few people are against, but they're not outspoken about it? Is the split kind of 50-50 like it seems, especially among delegates, how it used to be, or has it changed? And unfortunately, we didn't have the resources to finish the survey for that. And so some people say that was really bad, and some people say we shouldn't have gotten ahead with the removal. And I think they have a fair point. And I think it was unfortunate, but sticking with the existing plan, I think was the right thing to do, because if we just revise these things as they come along, then we never have a process. And so I want us to make sure that we prevent this from happening in the future without a process ahead of time that is clearly transparent to everyone. But dragging this out longer was also not good for the WCA or the community. So there was a plan, and we ended up sticking with it. But as I've alluded to earlier, I think the big issue is not whether feat was a good event or not, or whether this is worth the WCA to hold it or not. It's that we've had this big gap between official and unofficial events, and people really care about it if it's official, and if it's unofficial, it might as well be dead. And we need ways to bridge that, which we're slowly starting to see. And this is a thing that we've essentially lost over time. So back in the day, there was not a list of official events. People used to do 3x3x3 without inspection, or Rainbow Cube, and they would all sort of be hosted with results in the same place. And then we had an official event list, and the unofficial events still had their results listed somewhere. It was just separate but similar to the official ones. And then over time, that died out. And I actually asked Ron for some of that to try to bring it back, and that didn't quite happen. But now Speedcubing Extra Events, which used to be funcubing.org, is sort of picking up the torch and serving as an unofficial place to hold results from unofficial events at official competitions. And I'm really glad they're doing that, because that gives us a path to do it without the WCA having to spend resources working on it ourselves. So we're getting to a point where we can hopefully have a discussion about how do we deal with this gap, rather than is event X good or bad.
Was it the end of 2019 when it was not recognized anymore? So January 1st of 2020?
Yeah. So yes. So the official timeline was the end of 2018 was said at the end of 2019. So for the 2020 regulations, it will be removed, but we won't be part of the 2019 regulations. So we announced that at the end of 2018. And then at the end of 2019, with the discussions, we looked at things, and it was officially announced in around the beginning of December. And it went into effect January 1st. So fortunately, there was no competition that was spanning December 31st to January 1st, because that would have been a little bit tricky.
Mm-hmm. How will people's profiles look now with who have competed in feat?
I believe we haven't quite updated the website yet. Like, it was never anyone's goal to remove feat. It's not our goal to make it act like it's never happened. And we know it's still a little sad for some of the community. And so it's not urgent to try to fix the website, but what will happen eventually, hopefully in the near future, is that it'll look like Magic and Master Magic. So they'll still be on your profile at the bottom, but they won't show up under current records. But all the old results are still valid, and your old world records are still visible. for those results.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So I also can I mention some thoughts about this gap also?
Yeah, go right ahead.
So one thing I've been trying to figure out is if we can make it easier to hold unofficial events. So there's sort of two aspects to being able to compete in feat. There's the I can go to a competition and compete in it, and there's the I can have an official WCA world record. But even without the official WCA world record, there's still some value in being able to go to a competition and for other competitors to be taking it seriously. And that can still happen with unofficial events. And we can work on having an approach for the WCA to semi-officially recognize those, or to have one idea would be to have tiers of events or temporary events where you can still compete in them officially sometimes. And I'd like us to think about getting to a point like that. I think one first step I'm trying to move towards is to be able to sign up for events, for unofficial events during regular official sign up. And then perhaps WCA Live could just support it. Perhaps speed cubing extra events we could have a collaboration with, if they're the ones that host these de facto community results. There could be a gradual path where if you want to hold feat, it's just like any other event, it just won't currently have official status. And then we can essentially try out having events that are not with the full pressure of official WCA events. And we can see about adding more and maybe introducing more events without them being around permanently and needing to be held at every major championship. But a first step would be just to make it easy to hold these unofficial events so we can try them out without more friction for organizers and competitors.
So now that feat is removed, is there any chance of clock being removed as well? Because there has been some discussion about that.
Yeah, it's a little difficult to evaluate because it tends to be people are saying, "Oh, feat is removed. Are you going to remove clock now?" It's sort of like it's hard to tell what is reactionary and if people are just saying it because they're upset. I know not all of them are, but it gets a bit mixed. When the feat removal was announced, people commented on GitHub with issues saying, you should remove so-and-so or you should do so-and-so, like you have to do this now. And it was clear that it was reactionary, not because they thought that was a good idea and they had good arguments for it. It was, I didn't like this outcome. So, I'm going to throw something crazy out there. So I think at the moment, I would like to see if we can figure out this gap between official and unofficial events better before we discuss adding or removing any more events. Now, I know some people have said that we should have done that before removing feat, and I think there's some merit to that. But I think it's important that at least we don't do this again, so we don't have a similar discussion about other events without having a better way to handle it. So if we manage to get this gap to be smaller and for there to be something in between, like events that you can compete in and still have fun with without them being the same official status, then we can discuss whether to move events into a lower tier. That's maybe, the non-championship tier is something we've talked about, where you can still compete in it, but it's not at major championships. Or something that just, you can compete in regularly your local competitions, but it's just for fun. And with a sort of clear idea of what that would mean, we can then discuss at some point whether to move events into it. But I think it's not a good idea to start the discussion at how do we remove existing official events. I think it should start with how do we add new events to make the WCA better for people. One of the most common requests we get for the WRC is to add new events. And so once we navigate that, we can sort of expand it into how should we rethink the existing events. And I think I'd like to note one thing about that, which is I believe the stats are that clock is pretty similar with other events in terms of popularity. So big cubes, blind and multi-blind, or sort of they're not speed events in the sense that you have a separate room and you have separate conditions, and they're held less often, like that's expected. And so those are below most other events, but in terms of speed events that you have usually on main stage with a stack mat timer, Feat was the only one that was about 1/3 in terms of percentage participation below all other events, whereas Clock is similar to the others. So although there are some concerns with being able to hold Clock, and we might not be able to address those all with the changes for 2020 and upcoming, the popularity numbers show that Clock is actually on par with other events, I believe. And so removing it for popularity reasons is not as relevant, and the hygiene reasons or the logistics reasons are not quite as strong as they are for Feat. So I think we want to be careful about revising that now. And as I said, I would really rather focus on fixing this gap first.
What was the recent regulation you implemented for Clock?
So we discussed several changes for clocks. So there was one thing that was probably the most uncontroversial change we've had in a while, which is that clock pins are allowed to be distinguishable. So it used to be, sort of like history aside, is it used to be that we were actually fairly strict about puzzles, because there's this trade-off between being strict, so it's clear what's allowed, so it's consistent, and allowing what people actually want if they're not using it to cheat. And for a while, we were sort of being strict about things, and we started being lenient about various things, but somehow we never revised the clock pin requirement. And so at major championships last year, a bunch of clocks were being rejected for having little bits missing on their pins. And so we said, okay, it seems pretty much everyone agrees you're not getting an advantage from this, especially for clock, where you have an insert that shows you the orientation. And so we said, okay, it's time. We should not require clock pins to be indistinguishable. So that was an uncontroversial change. And then we said, okay, people are concerned about clocks falling over. So in some sense, pins don't matter for clock. Like at the end of the solve, the pin state doesn't matter. And when you're moving pins, you're not actually changing them dials. The only thing that matters for the solve state is the dials. So we said, well, what if we just change all scrambles to have all the clock pins up, so you could just lay it flat if you wanted to? This resolves the issues with the possibility of clocks falling over if you take out the cover, and having to be careful about that, and having to scramblers having to watch about that, and judges and competitors. So we discussed that, and so that we ended up not adopting because there were significant concerns that would change the event. And I think that's more of a subjective thing, and I think it's a thing we could get used to, but it was a concern people had. And so the change we ended up going for was to specify that you can use clock stands. So like for square one, you can add an insert to prevent the top or bottom from accidentally moving. Now organizers are officially, so this used to be a thing that was kind of unofficially done but never specified, but officially say you can use a clock stand, put the clock in it, and it won't topple over at the station, and then the judge should remove it at the beginning of the attempt. And hopefully this should address issues with clocks falling overs and causing extra attempts starting at the beginning of the attempt. And we'll have to see about how that does to address that problem.
If there was to be one event added to replace feet, what do you think has the highest chance of getting in?
Well, I really don't like thinking of it as a sort of pantheon where there's a certain number and something gets in, something gets out. I think this is sort of, that's a way to create divides between different people who don't fundamentally disagree. Ideally, we should be working on fun for everyone. And in the past, we actually, even though we get a lot of requests for new events, we haven't actually asked for this. If, as we're hoping, we actually do a community survey at the beginning of this year, we will definitely ask about this. And we have some ideas of what people might like. So there was interest in kilominx for a while, but I think because there was this large gap and it wasn't going to become official, that died down. And I'd like us to make sure that doesn't happen again, but that's where kilominx is. Team Blindfolded has been popular, but not quite obvious how to put it in the results. But it's an interesting new kind of format that I would really like to see us experiment more with. And then I believe the speedsolving.com forum is trying speed FMC. Then sometimes people are doing FMC dual, where it's sort of you go back and forth on a chess clock, you get one move each. Sort of different events or variations of events that haven't really been tried, I think, are more interesting than new puzzles. But there are some puzzles like ReadyCube or ReadyMinx or Kilominx that people also bring up. And I think it would be good to think about a balance of those. So it would be interesting to add a new puzzle and a new kind of format, so that there's new development of algorithms as well as new development of what it means to do a collaborative event, or what it means to do a head-to-head official event or something like that. And I would like to see those kinds of things be explored, and would like to see them being explored before we add them officially so that we know how they look. So those are sort of the examples in my mind, and some of the requests that we get most often from people contacting the WRC.
You mentioned you wanted to talk about the regulations. Did we cover that already?
Yeah, mostly. Let's see. I have a sort of a checklist. So we've talked about a little bit about a survey. The WAC, the advisor committee, will hopefully work on getting that out with more of a focus of where should we go from here? Like, the WRC at this point, we sort of need to take stock and ask, especially for delegates, what can we do for you that makes it more practical to hold competitions? So right now, some things are confusing. What are the most confusing things? So our focus should be on trying to understand that, as well as, what are the most important changes you think we could make to some particular detail. I talked about unofficial events. I'd like us to start splitting up the regulations into some guides for things like what puzzles are okay or what counts as a misalignment. There's goals to make it easier to understand the regulations by redoing significant parts. And so I have an idea that I'd like to put together for a mid-year regulations update in 2020, where we sort of don't focus on big competitor-facing changes, but we just make it easier, especially for delegates, but also anyone who's trying to read the regulations, to understand how certain things are handled that right now require interpreting or looking around different parts of the regulations. So those are more maintenance kind of things that are going on that are less juicy to talk about, but also on our mind.
It's a regulation right now that every competitor needs to have read the regulations, right?
Well, they need to follow the regulations.
Okay.
They should know and understand them. I would love for us to get to a point where you have a subset that just the competitors just need to know. So we have an official tutorial, but it doesn't have that status. It would be great if we could get to a point where we say, you just have to know this part. We've been careful not to do that before. Like, if we just do this once and we don't maintain it very well, then we have yet another place to look and things that can get out of sync. But if we do it well, then hopefully we have a better balance and something that is actually really practical, which unfortunately we don't have right now.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Lucas, thanks so much for joining me today on episode 90 of the Corner Cutter podcast.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. Good luck with the future.
Wow, that was an awesome interview. It was really nice getting the real information straight from the WRC leader and not just hearing people's opinions on what should be done or what might happen. That was really cool. So if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to share it with a friend. Just hit that share button if you're listening on YouTube, or just tell somebody about the podcast and this episode. After we wrapped up the interview, we talked for another 12 minutes about some cubing technology Lucas is working on, and also about the Red Bull competitions and what's going on with that and how the WCA is dealing with that. And you Patreon supporters will be getting access to that audio. And you can access that at thecornercutterpodcast.com/Patreon. Before we wrap up today's episode, I got an audio voicemail from Tony, also known as Twisty Cuber, Twisty with 2 eyes. And he shared a review of the Valk 2. So I'll play that right now.
Hey guys, so today I'm going to be doing a brief review of the Qi Valk 2M. So it has a smooth but clacky kind of feeling when you turn it, and the plastic feels kind of thick. Like, it's very different from the Valk 3, which has a very hollow feeling when you turn it. So it does feel pretty thick, the outside plastic, when you turn it, it feels pretty thick. But it's quite heavy compared to 2x2s, such as the Chuan and the Wuxia, the Gan 249, all those 2x2s that are like really light. This one, it feels, it has quite of a heft to it. The corner cutting is phenomenal, reverse and forward. It's as you'd expect it to be, very nice. And out of the box, it's pretty decent. I would recommend using, after some time, I'd recommend using some light lube to sort of speed it up a little, because it can kind of feel a bit tiring when you turn it for a while without so I have gotten pops and internal pops on it and even corner twists, but proper tensions and a nice accurate turning style should fix these issues. Overall, it's a great cube. I would recommend it to anyone that wants to really do 2x2 seriously, since it is $20. It's not on the budget side.
Thank you, Tony, for sending in that review. Good job. And if you want to send in a review of your cube, go to thecornercutterpodcast.com/feedback. Click on record an audio message. You can record it right there through SpeakPipe. And the good thing about SpeakPipe is you can re-record your message as many times as you need to before you actually send it. So don't worry if you mess up the first time. You'll have 90 seconds to record it. Thank you all so much for listening to episode 90. I appreciate your continued support, even though the episodes haven't been very consistent over the past few months, and there hasn't been very many. But I love seeing your messages and emails saying you enjoy the show and keep up the good work. I appreciate that. And now it's time to take episode 90 back to the scrambling table, and I'll talk to you guys again next week in episode 91 of the Corner Cutter Podcast. Okay, so Patriots versus Titans. Loss. So Patriots got out in the wild card game. That's very disappointing, but what can you do? So hopefully next year Brady will be able to get some more receivers that he trusts, and they'll be able to push through to the Super Bowl, or at least to the first playoff wild card, really. Oh man. So football's kind of, well, there's still the other teams. Kansas City versus Houston was a great game, but I don't really pull for any other team like I do the Patriots. But there's other things to look forward to, like the presidential election coming up later this year. I'm guessing it's going to be a landslide victory for the current president, and I'm really excited about that. So we'll have him for another 4 years. Well, that's it for the podcast this week. Thanks for listening, true fans. Bye.